Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day. Welcome to the CES Letters. My name is Easton. I'm joined here today with my good friend, Brian Hales. Brian Hales is the author of multiple books about the practice of polygamy and specifically Joseph Smith's polygamy. He also is currently writing and will hopefully have within the next year a book about the Book of Mormon. I'm very excited for this episode as we dive into this question of Joseph Smith and polygamy that Jeremy Reynolds brings up with the CES Letter. So without further ado, I present to you Polygamy and the CES Letter with Brian Hales. Brian, how are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having me, Easton.
I'm glad you're here. Number one, I want to thank you for all your research on this. You are one of the authorities when it comes to polygamy, who is also a member of the church. You know this better than just about anybody else that we could ever think about. So thank you for your time in being here, but thanks for your research as well.
Well, you're very kind, and I don't know that would be true. I probably have studied the topic more than anyone, but if I were going to be known for something in the church, polygamy would not be my first choice. So
Sure, that makes sense. As we get started, we like to ask this question. And let me point out to our listeners, this is one of two episodes that we have with Brian. There might be more to come in the following weeks and months and years, I'm sure. But I'd invite you to go check out that other one whenever it's posted. I'm not sure which order we're posting these in. But Brian, we like to get started with this question, and the question is, what's something about you that nobody else knows? Kind of like a fun fact about you.
Well, having this be our second interview, I already used up my first one, but when I was in high school, I was in a dance band, and we weren't very good, but we had a really pretty singer, and she'd just sit out in front and sang really well, and so we played a lot of gold and green balls. You're too young to know what those were, but the church used to have in each ward, and sometimes wards would combine, they would have a dance called the Gold and Green Ball, and they would hire dance bands. And during high school, I made a lot of money playing keyboards and a little guitar and singing probably more than I should have in a dance band. We were called Redwood, so people used to refer to us as Deadwood, but we weren't really appreciative of that. But
sure. I think that's a great, interesting fact. I definitely didn't know that about you. The other thing that we like to start with is just so we can kind of understand who you are as a person, Brian, is how have you gotten to the point where you are a scholar in the church? What brought you from just being some regular random guy to, I'm going to dive into the topics as in church history as much as you have?
Well, I think people may have already know this, but I had a family member who was excommunicated for practicing polygamy. She joined the All Red group, and so I investigated the topic and ended up writing several books on Mormon fundamentalism. And personally, I was just never impressed with their claims to authority. Their claims that the keys of the sealing left the church never impressed me. But people were asking me more about Joseph Smith than about the Mormon fundamentalists, and so I hired Don Bradley, and we worked together and had 3 volumes come out in 2013 and on Joseph Smith's polygamy, where we tried to get every known document that anybody had made, irrespective of whether they believed in Joseph or not, and include it in there to be comprehensive. And of course, my 3 books have been criticized, but the one criticism that really I haven't heard is that we left anything out. And transparency is very important to me, regardless of the topic. And so that one compliment is that we tried to include everything. If we were to do a second edition, which we're not, there's probably a handful of things that I would include in a second edition, data that's come available in the last 10 years. But honestly, I wouldn't anticipate any real big changes, other than I wouldn't talk about polyandry so much because I think it's a ridiculous claim. But we can talk about that in a few minutes. So.
Right. Yep, we'll talk about that a little bit today. As kind of an introduction to our listeners today, we will be talking all about the section in the CES letter titled Polygamy and Polyandry. One thing I would like to point out is that we additionally, in addition to some of the questions and concerns here in this section of the CES letter, we also have gotten a bunch of questions from people on our Instagram, and kind of towards the end of our episode today, we're going to be going over those questions as well. As some of them I think are a little bit more straight to the point than than much of what is written here in the CES letter. The second thing I'd like to point out is that, Brian, you wrote an excellent article that's published, and you can find it in our show notes here on the podcast, that answers most of these questions. So this is kind of here, this podcast is here to supplement that letter, and the letter is there to supplement kind of this podcast. So I'm going to tell our listeners with 100% assurity, we're not going to answer every question you've ever had about polygamy today or about polyandry or anything in that nature. But I knowing Brian, he's going to give a good perspective. But if you really want to know the answers to this, go check out his article, go read the footnotes, go to the additional sources noted, because there's a lot that you really can learn in this. So, Brian, as we get started, you kind of start your article explaining how the CES letter briefly addresses several issues. These issues include Fanny Alger. How do you pronounce her last name? Alger?
Well, I used to pronounce it Fanny Alger.
Okay.
Or Alger, actually. And then I met a man whose last name was spelled that way, and he said, no, it's Alger. And so for several years, I was correcting people, say, no, it's Alger. But then I had another person come up to me very gently and say, no, it's Alger, and that was her name.
Oh.
And so it depends on the family line is my conclusion here, and we have no idea how Fanny and her family pronounced it. So
Interesting. So how do you pronounce it now today?
I don't know. It depends on the day. I probably
sense.
Default to Alger, but
Okay.
Again, I used Alger for years too,
Sure.
so I don't know.
To me, in my brain, it's Alger, so I'll go with that. So we'll first talk about Fanny Alger, who is Joseph Smith's first plural wife. We'll talk about polyandry, which is when a woman has multiple husbands. We'll talk about how Joseph Smith, did Joseph Smith have young wives? How young were some of his wives? We'll talk about Emma Smith, who was Joseph's legal wife. We'll talk about the denials of polygamy, and then we'll talk about Joseph Smith's general practice of polygamy. That's all there, just kind of to set up the way we're going to talk about that. Let's first start to talk about Fanny Alger. And as we get started, Brian, before you kind of explain the whole situation, why do people have a problem with Fanny Alger? Why is there concern with Fanny Alger? Could you kind of give us that overview as well?
Well, I think initially part of the problem was that some authors were saying that Joseph may have married her in 1831 or 1833, which she was 19 and 36, so that would have made her very young, 14 or so. And it's shown now, and we know that she could not have even been in the Smith household until really about 1834. So I think initially some of the accusers were using poor data or conclusions. So her youth is an issue, but she was 18 at the time, I think, that she was married to Joseph Smith. But the other side of it is that it's clear that Emma, at least from the data we have, and the data is not as good as we'd like. And in Appendix D, I think in Volume 2 of my trilogy on polygamy, I have an appendix where I put all of the accounts that we could find, Don Bradley and I could find, that deal with Fanny Alger, and there's 19. And that's it. And some of them are pretty brief. Some of them are contradictory. But what the story that they tell is that Joseph didn't tell Emma. He did marry her. I think that's still a controversial point, but the data is there that that Joseph Smith approached Fanny's parents to get permission, which is kind of an odd scenario for a polygamous marriage, but that's what the historical record indicates to us. And he did it through Levi Hancock, who was Fanny's uncle. And so he got permission, and then Levi Hancock performed a marriage that in Joseph's eyes, God recognized as a bona fide marriage. So this was in Joseph's eyes polygamy. But apparently this all transpired without telling Emma. And at some point, according to William McClellan, who was talking to Emma in 1847, at some point Emma found them in a barn. And I was just in Kirtland last month, and I asked Mark Staker if we know where the barn is, because they've restored the home they were living in, and actually very small when they were there. And Fanny was a domestic there, and I don't know where she would have slept. It was very small at that point. It hadn't been enlarged. But there was a barn somewhere around there that they don't know where, and Emma found them in the transaction. Caught them in the transaction is the word I think used by William McClellan. Now, what does that mean? Was this some kind of affection, or was this the marriage ceremony, or something? We don't know. But Emma caught them doing something that was clearly unacceptable to her, and even with the explanation from Joseph that the angel said we've got to do polygamy now. And what's interesting is that everybody that Joseph told about this relationship thought it was adultery, because he told Emma rejected it, but Joseph, to get some help, went and talked to Oliver Cowdery. Oliver comes in there, he agrees with Emma. And so there's everybody that Joseph is telling is just saying, Joseph, you shouldn't have done this. This is wrong. This was an affair. This was a scrape or something, Oliver later called it. But the interesting thing is that everybody that Fanny told considered it an actual plural marriage recognized by God. And this included her family, who stayed in the church and followed the saints all over, and her uncle, Levi Hancock, stayed in the church. At that point, Eliza R. Snow was living in the house, or was nearby, was teaching school, and she said she was well acquainted with Fanny. And she listed Fanny in her own handwriting on a list of plural wives as a plural wife of Joseph Smith. So she considered it a marriage. And then we know also that Fanny went to stay with the Webbs, Chauncey Webb, and Eliza is the daughter, Mary Elizabeth Webb, Mary something Webb. She stayed with them until she could relocate to her family. Then this for a few weeks there in Kirtland. They also related how this was a marriage, or at least Fanny thought it was a marriage, and so did they. And they stayed in the church until Utah. And so with Fanny, we don't have the data that we would like, but there's certainly reasons to believe that this was a plural marriage, at least in the eyes of the participants, especially Fanny. And anyway, that's kind of an overview of what we're talking about.
I think that's a great overview. I'm sure we'll be talking about this a little bit later, but I think it's a good immediate question. Well, and I guess before that, just to make sure I'm correct. So Fanny was 18 years old when they got married?
We don't have a date for the marriage ceremony. We only have a date for when it was discovered, and that's the summer of 1836. And so if you think about that, if the marriage was, the sealing keys were restored April 3rd of 1836, this marriage is discovered a couple of months later. And so if it were in that period, it could have been the very first sealing in the church. I've traditionally dated it late 1835, but there's no real reason for that timing other than the angel came in the middle of 1834 commanding it, according to Joseph's report to Mary Elizabeth Rollins. So I would have thought it would take a year or so for that all to unfold. But we really don't know. And Don Bradley has written an article, it's just recently published, on where he's dating it after April 3rd, making it a sealing. And if it were before that, the authority would just be priesthood authority, and it wouldn't be an eternal marriage. But Joseph would have had the authority. He declared that he did, and he could have given that to Levi, priesthood authority to perform the marriage in a way that God would recognize it, even if the state of Ohio didn't. So that's kind of the timeline.
I think that's great. So the CES letter, it claims, and this is verified by the church's 2014 polygamy essay, but that Joseph Smith was at least married to 34 women. Is that a correct number?
Do you know, it depends who we want to read. The first person to make a list was a woman named Fawn Brody, who wrote No Man Knows My History, and she had 48.
Oh, wow.
But 2 of them are duplicates. But it's a remarkable list all the same, because she's not working with computers and things. So she had 46 net. The list most commonly used is Todd Compton's, which is 33, and it's a very fine list. George D. Smith had 38. I think Richard Bushman had 32. My list has 35. I've added 2 to Todd Compton's list, but these additions are added with some pretty dubious evidence, but I've just tried to be complete. So somewhere between 33 and 35, and you said 34, so that's a good number.
All of them are there.
I do know that church historians have been working on their own list, and it has 3 different types of wives who reported they were Joseph's wives, people, and then a second group where the evidence is really strong that they were, and then a third group that is kind of, there's some dubious names in there. I looked at them, I'd rejected them from my list, but when you put all those numbers together, it's 38. So, somewhere in the 30s, but by my accounting, about a third of these are eternity-only non-sexual marriages. We can talk about that.
Right, and that was kind of my next question. So it starts with Fanny Alger sometime in 1835, 36, somewhere in that timeline. With her relationship and with the others, were many consummated, or were only some? Were any of them? I think that would be a good place to go from here, looking at Fanny Alger and then the other wives.
There's some evidence that Fanny Alger might have been pregnant when she left. We didn't really talk about what happened to her. She went to stay with her family. Her family were migrating to Jackson County, but they stopped in Indiana, or at least she did. And she married a local young man, Custer was his name, and stayed there, raised 9 children. There's no evidence that she bore a child anywhere in the timeline close to where she would have delivered if Joseph were the father. But there is a statement from an antagonist that says it implies that she was pregnant, and that's why she got married so quickly in Indiana, and that makes some sense. And again, some people read that as pretty solid evidence that she was pregnant. It had been consummated, but again, there's speculation involved there. When Joseph finally gets to Nauvoo, we hear that the angel came a second time to say we want polygamy. And yet we see Joseph demurring. I mean, he's dragging his feet, which wasn't the way Joseph attacked things. I mean, he was bold in so many ways. But when it came to plural marriage in Nauvoo, what we find is there's a marriage reportedly in 1841 to Louisa Beeman, who was single, and there's good evidence it was consummated. Don Bradley positions that to a year later in 1842, and there's some good reasons to think that might be the case. But other than that one marriage, the first half a dozen or so of these sealings are to women who are legally married. And some people will look at those, and there's a new book chapter out by Todd Compton where he proclaims over and over that this represents simultaneous husbands. In other words, Joseph is the woman is staying with her husband, having a family with him, but periodically she'll arrive with Joseph and they're having sexual relations. And that's what Todd is portraying. And I have an article that's out in the recent Journal of Mormon History, and where I look at these polyandrous sealings, and I don't even like to use the word polyandry because people throw it out there without telling us exactly what does that mean. Is this somebody with 2 simultaneous husbands? Or is this a woman who's had 2 marriage ceremonies? Because Joseph Smith introduced a second type of marriage where it involved eternity. You are married for time and eternity, and in Nauvoo, there's a number of women who refer to their marriages to Joseph as just for eternity. And so the idea was they would have one husband on earth, their legal husband, and then when they died, they would have Joseph to be their eternal husband. Now, this sounds all weird, I get it, but this is really what we're understanding in the documents, and it's well described in the case of Ruth Vos Sayers. The problem is there's a lot of ambiguity in how the word polyandry and how these descriptions are, and so Todd has taken these and concluded that this is simultaneous husbands, not consecutive husbands. And in my article in the Journal of Mormon History, I argue that no, these are consecutive husbands. And there's an additional piece of the puzzle that he hasn't really considered, and nobody has, and I think until my article, and that is, look, if Joseph had taught that he could be a second husband to a woman, she can have sex with her husband and then come and be with him. If that happened, nobody complained, and none of the women defended it. Okay, now flip that to polygyny. This is our traditional polygamy, where you have one man with multiple wives. Joseph did practice that. People mostly agree with it today, although there's a growing movement that says that he was a monogamist, which we won't talk about now. But he was a polygamist. Let there be no doubt on that point. But there are people who are saying that Joseph introduces a plurality of wives, and there's a huge backlash. And people don't like it. Now, it's in the Bible. Abraham was a polygamist. Jacob was a polygamist. The house of Israel came to four wives of Jacob. And so this is a biblical practice. It's never condemned in the Bible. But then these polyandry advocates are saying Joseph introduced a plurality of husbands, and nobody says anything about it. And if we look at the data, we know at least over 20 men and women, polygamy insiders, were aware as participants in these sealings. Somebody would have, I think, wanted to defend the behavior. Why? Because in Romans, in the New Testament, and these are all devout Christians, it says in Romans 7:2-3, that if a woman is with a second husband when she's married, it's adultery. So for Joseph to introduce polyandry as simultaneous husbands, he had a huge mountain to climb, because he had to tell people, well, Paul's wrong, or whoever wrote Romans is wrong. I can be your second husband and it's okay. Well, nobody related that. Nobody's defending it. But what's also interesting is that John C. Bennett in 1842 reports that some of Joseph Smith's spiritual wives are already legally married. So the idea that Joseph Smith has spiritual wives that are married, is out there. It's public. People know about this. His enemies can read what John Bennett wrote. But what's interesting is when John Bennett left, he had a whole laundry list of claims against Joseph and the Mormons. Polyandry's not on there. 2 years later, William Law leaves, and he has a laundry list of complaints. Polyandry isn't there. He was a polygamy insider. John Bennett wasn't. But nobody is using this term. I can't find anyone complaining about polyandry until about 1850. And it's just somebody who's looking at what's happening there and making a conclusion, not somebody who's talking to an insider who's reporting this, because none of the women ever do report that they actually had two simultaneous husbands.
So I guess kind of to reiterate and just so that I can make sure that I understand what you're saying, most of these quote-unquote polyandry marriages, they were married to one husband here on earth, but then they were sealed to Joseph Smith for eternity. Would that be a correct way to say that?
Right. They're consecutive husbands, not simultaneous.
Right, at the same time. What would the desire be to be sealed to Joseph Smith and not their actual husbands or their current husbands?
That is an excellent question. Now, in the case of Ruth Vosayers, her husband was not a member of the church. And he really liked Joseph, but just didn't believe in this religious stuff. And he actually encouraged her to go and be sealed to Joseph for eternity. So we know that ordinance existed from some pretty good evidence. Now, the truth of the matter is that there's a lot of ambiguity, and I would argue in the data that the polyandry proponents present, that was a tongue twister there, that the data that they present is actually, there's a lot of ambiguity there. There's ambiguity in the data that I'm presenting that says, no, these are consecutive marriages, consecutive husbands. There's ambiguity, there's contradictions. But the one point that we can all agree on, I think, is that nobody reacted to this. And it would have been the most explosive thing Joseph ever taught or did if he had taught that it's okay for him to be a second husband to a woman who's already married. And in my article, I researched polyandry historically. And at no time is polyandry acceptable, except there are a few places, small groups of hundreds of people in Tibet, and places where resources are scarce and women are scarce. And their polyandry is practiced, but it's not without problems because of husband jealousy and things of this nature. And to portray Joseph Smith as just adding plurality of husbands to a plurality of wives, the same way he added water to wine as things we can use in the sacrament, to me is just highly naive and not believable. And yet that seems to be a new message from this article. And Todd Compton actually has been very kind. He let me read the article a year ago, and so I wrote a response which came out in the Journal of Mormon History. And people can just look at the data. But if you can imagine Joseph doing this the way he's portrayed and nobody reacting with complaints or defenses, that there's nothing more really for me that I can say about it. I just don't believe that it could have happened that way.
Great. I think that's a really great kind of overview of this polyandry. Is there anything else that you'd like to add about polyandry, or do you think we should move on to the title Young Wives?
No, I just wish we would accept this new piece of the puzzle and maybe stop accusing Joseph of doing something that would have been just so highly volatile that there's no way somebody wouldn't have mentioned it.
Right. It would have been a very big deal if it had actually happened. The
biggest deal of all of the things that he ever taught or did.
Right. I think that's very important for us to recognize. Okay, so we shared a little bit earlier. Joseph Smith was married to 33, 34, 38 wives, somewhere around there. How old were these wives? Were they very young? Were some old? Was there a big mixture between the two, or were any of them of age even? I guess help us dive into this question.
Well, the young wives question is kind of a huge deal for us today, because what we find is there are religious leaders, charismatic males, most of them, who after a while, they're sleeping with their parishioners, and some of them are going after very young parishioners or followers like Warren Jeffs. And
which is mentioned extensively in the CES letter itself.
Yeah, he tries to compare Warren Jeffs and Joseph Smith, and there are some very general similarities and some very important dissimilarities. I in fact, went up to Canada twice to serve as an expert witness in a court case where they were prosecuting followers of Warren Jeffs. And I was able to dive into his teachings to these people, not to mention the history behind it all. That's why I was there primarily. But
that's an interesting thing to put on your resume.
Well, I've never been in a court before or
Right.
offered testimony. It was Richard Bennett was there the first time and did a great job too. But the point is that the similarities stop very quickly. Both men practice the form of polygamy, but and I don't know if we want to talk about the dissimilarities now. There's quite a number of those that I could point out kind of quickly. First,
yeah, that'd be awesome.
Well, first off, Joseph was sealed to, by my count, 30, maybe 35 women. But about a third of them are non-sexual eternity-only sealings. New evidence, and I did some research for this, was that Warren Jeffs was sealed to 83. And there's a picture of him with many of them, and they're all dressed in their pretty gowns and or dresses. And the age of the youngest wife for Warren Jeffs is 12, and it's barely 12, and she's very small. And you just would worry if she were to get pregnant, how the delivery could possibly happen. With Joseph Smith, the youngest wife's age is 14, and it's Hellamar Kimball, and it may have been Nancy Winchester, we're not sure. And then there is a 16-year-old, Flora Woodworth. The reality is we have no evidence that Joseph was ever alone with these people and to consummate these marriages. And Helen especially was not called to testify in the Temple Lock case, where they did call 3 women, all of which testified of having sexual relations with Joseph Smith, because they wanted to prove this was real polygamy. Helen just lived a few blocks from where they were taking the depositions in Salt Lake City in 1892. They didn't call her, and I think that's a good indicator that she couldn't give the testimony that they needed. There's no evidence, and my late wife Laura Hales did a presentation on this, that Joseph and Helen were ever alone together. They were together once with a chaperone after the ceremony. But if you look at the ceremony, it was arranged by her father. It was approved by her mother. She didn't really like it, but she approved of it. And there's just no evidence the two were together alone after that point. And so lots of reasons to think of this more as a betrothal. And so the age of the youngest wife of a consummated marriage with Joseph Smith would have been 17. And a 17-year-old bride in that day and age was not scandalous. It was probably eyebrow-raising a little bit. And, of course, the age difference, and this is polygamy, enter factors that we really don't know what to do with in a monogamous society.
How old would Joseph Smith have been at this time?
Let's see, 42. He was born technically in 06, so he would be 35, 36 range or something like that.
So quite a bit older.
So, yeah, double the age. But there are examples of people marrying with gaps. And, again, it's not scandalous. For the times, it it could be acceptable, although this is polygamy, so how do we relate it to monogamy?
Right.
But some of the differences, and it isn't necessarily polygamy, but Warren Jeffs taught that more wives in eternity is a greater reward. And that has never been a doctrine of the church. He taught that he would tightly control who was to marry whom. And we know Joseph was turned down by at least 5 different women. And when he turned them down, he didn't try to destroy their reputations. Now, when Sarah Pratt and Jane Law made public what was going on, Joseph defended himself against them. But these 5 women, Joseph wasn't coercing these women into it in a very active sense. I mean, the fact that the prophet is asking about marriage, you would feel some pressure there. But 5 women just told him no way, or at least through representatives says, no, that isn't going to work for me. But Warren Jeffs goes on. I mean, the control factor is huge. He controls their property. He controls men's wives. He came out and said that nobody gets to have sex with your wife until I get out of prison. He modified that later to identify a group of men who could father children in the kingdom, and these men would go around and if you see polygamist families there for a while, you never saw any babies. They were all just older children or adults. And at least those that were following him. And these are kinds of things that Joseph never would have allowed. He tried to broker a marriage for his brother William, and the woman said, I don't want to marry William. And Joseph said, okay. And so what you find is Joseph Smith was highly committed to free agency. And in the case of the 16-year-old, Flora Woodworth had a confrontation with Emma. Emma apparently found out about the sealing. And after that, Flora was really upset. She went out and married a non-member, Carlos Gove. And Joseph granted what we would call today a cancellation of the sealing, or a divorce. So even though Flora was married for a time, she was also divorced from Joseph as a plural wife for a time. And so you can see that Joseph is worried about people, and he's not using control at any level that I can detect, other than there would certainly be some feeling of, I'm dealing with the prophet. But interestingly enough, these women, there were several of them that were just willing to tell him no. And that is so different from what Warren Jeffs was doing before he was imprisoned. So.
I think that's really important to recognize. So again, I just want to clarify, the youngest consummated marriage was 17, but then he also was married to a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old, though the evidence suggests they weren't ever alone, so they were just for eternity only, basically. Would that be a correct way to put that? Or?
There's a second one who was probably 14, but may have been 15, Nancy Winchester. And we only know about that sealing because there was an affidavit made decades later identifying it as a plural marriage. There's nothing in the historical record to tell us anything about it. We do know that her father was a friend of Joseph's, and that she, Nancy Winchester, was a really good friend of Helen Mar Kimball. In my mind, I can hear Helen say, you should be sealed to Joseph too, that kind of a conversation, but it's speculation completely. Right. But we don't know anything about that other one. So 2 14-year-olds, a 16-year-old. 16-year-old was divorced, and the 14-year-old we've got pretty good data on because she wrote more in favor of polygamy and Joseph Smith than any other female author in the 19th century.
Very interesting.
Later in her life.
Awesome. Well, let's move on, and I think that this will be one of the most interesting things I think we talk about. At least this is one of the things that interests me the most, and that is, let's talk about Emma Smith, Joseph's legal wife, who I just want to say I love Emma Smith. She is one of my favorite people of the Restoration, and right now we're planning on doing a full episode where we just focus on Emma Smith as a person and as we talk about her. So I want to just give that as a shout out. But let's talk about Emma Smith. Did she know about these sealings before they happened? Did she know about polygamy? Did she know? Will you just give us the full, I don't know where you want to start with, Emma, but that's kind of where I'm thinking is, did she even know about this when it had started?
We have some pretty good evidence that she rejected it completely in Kirtland, 1836. And we have the evidence that the angel came a second time. We don't know what the third time was early in February of 1842. But the angel comes saying, Joseph, do this. And so in Nauvoo, Joseph comes in, and he may have been married to Louisa Beeman, but then he's sealed to all of these legally married women, by my account, just for eternity. And in my mind, what Joseph is doing here is he's creating polygamous marriages that are non-sexual and would not bother Emma. I don't think Joseph wanted to bother Emma. And so he's trying to satisfy the angel that's saying do polygamy by being sealed to legally married women for the next life. And that just is weird to me. I get that too, that some of these women had devout Latter-day Saint husbands, and why Joseph didn't say, just go be sealed to your husband, I do not understand. And again, it's a question that I think is unanswerable, but Joseph's pattern is one that avoids sexuality. And to me, he would only pursue that because he didn't want to hurt Emma. So I see Joseph Smith as trying to be sensitive to Emma's feelings, even though behind her back, he is marrying plural wives and may have actually married and consummated one marriage without her knowledge. Now, the timeline suggests that in early 1843, well, let's back up. February of 1842, the angel comes for the third time, according to Mary Elizabeth Rollins, and says, and this time he's got a sword. It's not a flaming sword, okay? You see people out there saying, came with a flaming sword. No, you're getting that mixed up with Genesis. But it's just a sword, but the sword is to emphasize to Joseph, we want you to start marrying polygamously just like Abraham and Jacob did. And so from that point forward, March, April, Joseph is proposing to Nancy Rigdon, single, unmarried, totally rejects him. But it's the first time he's really creating a series of proposals to single women. And we then find evidence that he's consummating the marriages. Okay, with the legal women, there's no evidence that any of them were consummated. But with the single women that he's marrying after the third angel visit, we find that he is. And of course, this is going on behind Emma's back. And you can understand Joseph is finally deciding to follow the angel, even at the risk of making Emma feel bad. There is evidence that Emma discovered the eternity-only seedlings early in 1843. It's limited, but Joseph may have tried to introduce first, well, yeah, I am sealed to these women for eternity in a way that she would find acceptable to her. But then we find that in May of 1843, she finally accepts it. And several really good things happen. The first one is that she is admitted into the endowed quorum. Joseph had restored the temple endowment a year before, but almost nothing had been done, and no women had been admitted until Emma had accepted this form of eternal marriage. And so the two of them are sealed together. Emma wasn't Joseph's first sealed spouse. Some people find that bothersome, and I understand why. But he waited until she could accept the principle, and then they were sealed. And she, by several accounts, participated in plural sealings to the Lawrence sisters and to the Partridge sisters in May. But what we find is within weeks, and Eliza Partridge said that from the very first night after Joseph stayed with Emily, or I think it was Emily, after that point, Emma Smith, who was kind of in control of their lives because they lived there in the mansion house, she was disapproving of their ever being with Joseph. And so here she's participating, and almost instantly she turns. And understandably, I mean, I'm not criticizing her. This would be really tough. And so through June, she's struggling. And in the first part of July, she's struggling. And then what do we find Hiram doing in July, on July 12th? Do you know where I'm going with this? Hiram says, Joseph, why don't you just dictate a revelation? Right now, you're just saying this is what God is revealing to us. So dictate a revelation. I'll take it to her. I'll read it to her. I bet she'll accept it. Well, he dictated section 132, and he brought it to Emma, and Emma rejected it completely.
Goes poorly.
Yeah. And Joseph just said, well, you don't know Emma as well as I do. And but that's how we got section 132, and it was written by William Clayton, and a copy was made by Joseph Kingsbury, which we have today. Provenance is solid. It hasn't been edited or changed or made up by Brigham Young. It's a true document that traces very well back to Joseph Smith. But Emma was participating, and we have several different accounts that Emma burned the original Clayton copy, or that she had Joseph burn it or something, but it was destroyed at Emma's bidding. But the very next day, we find that there is a lot of tears, and Clayton is called in, and they deed over some property to Emma. She's apparently setting up for maybe a separation or divorce. And there's talk of a divorce in Clayton's journal for Joseph and Emma. But ultimately, by September, she's friendly. And she, according to Melissa Lott, approved of Joseph being sealed to Melissa. But for the last 8 or 9 months, we really don't know anything about what's going on behind the doors with Emma. There is another sealing for eternity to Fanny Young in November. There's a poisoning incident that I think is overread by the prophet. I think Joseph said, Emma tried to poison me, and I'm going, well, if you're trying to poison somebody, why would you give them something that makes them throw up? And then they're throwing up the poison. That's not how it works, But there's obviously some problems there, but she becomes pregnant with David in January. And what is interesting to me about Emma is that before Joseph is going to Carthage to die, Emma is asked to go with him. Joseph says, come with me and stay with me. So Joseph never introduced any of his plural wives as his wife in public at any time that we know of. Emma was always the only public wife, the only legal wife. That was Emma, even though he had the wives through spiritual ceremonies, the sealing ceremony that were his wives in a religious sense. But he goes to Emma, he counsels with Emma, and he says, come with me to Carthage. And Emma says, I can't. We've got the children here. We've got the house to take care of. And Joseph said, well, then write a blessing of what you want, and I will sign it, and it will be a blessing for you from me, something I can give to you now. And at that point in time, she didn't know Joseph was going to die because Joseph had forecasted his death on multiple occasions. And he said, now you've got everything. Now I can be killed and everything's okay. Well, no, it wasn't everything because we still had the endowment, still had sealings and things. But at that point, he's saying this, and Emma's not confident. She thinks he's coming back. So she writes this prayer, and in the prayer she asks God to give her a place by Joseph Smith's side in eternity. And it's very clear from what she's writing at this very late date. She's a polygamy insider. She's seen it all. She knows Joseph better than anyone. She still sustains him as a prophet and as her husband, and wants to be with him in the next life, believing that this marriage can be eternal. And so whatever is going on, she still believes. And that for me is a lesson. That Joseph wasn't perfect. Section 132 tells Emma to forgive Joseph his trespasses against her. So apparently he could have done things better, and we can certainly second guess some of his decisions on polygamy and Emma in that space. But the reality is that his sins were not so great that we should doubt that the two of them can be together. Now, Emma did deny polygamy, and a couple of places it seems to be pretty solid language. She did admit polygamy to people like William McClellan, Eliza Snow left a testimony, Bathsheba Smith, and Jane Richards. So we have firsthand accounts from people saying, no, Emma was there, she knew it, she did it. But in a couple of public responses later in life, when her husband has built a church that's built upon the idea that Joseph Smith Jr. wasn't a polygamist, in those settings, she denies that Joseph was a polygamist. And there are people today who want to say, oh, no, you just got to believe Emma or not. But it's not that simple, because we have all these other people who are giving us these accounts and relating reports that Emma absolutely was involved and knew about it. And so what do we do with Emma if, in fact, she is denying something that she knew was true? Eliza Snow said if she denied it, she died with libel on her lips, because they were good friends in Nauvoo, at least for a time. And what do we do? Well, just don't judge. I think Emma's going to be fine. And if she stumbled, she didn't stumble so bad that she can't be forgiven. And church members shouldn't think the worst of Emma. She had the worst row. She was the only woman who had to worry that the revelation came from someplace other than God because she was inadequate as a wife or something. I mean, she really faced challenges that no other plural wife would have faced. And I just encourage us all to use a lot of charity with Emma.
Absolutely. Something that I love that our good friend Steve Harper says often is Emma understood her covenants and she lived up to her covenants. And I think that's all we can ask for basically most people, is if they lived up to their covenants, even though they might have messed up sometimes, even though they might have sinned here and there, they might have denied it, even though it was the truth. She knew her covenants and she lived up to them better than I think most of us do nowadays. So I think she's an excellent person. Anything else you feel we should add about Emma Smith?
No, I appreciate you letting me go on and on and on.
I love it.
Well, I worked for 35 years as an anesthesiologist. My ability to put people to sleep, is something I used to charge for.
Right.
So.
I love that. So the next two sections, and I feel that we've talked about denials pretty well. Is there anything you'd like to add about denials?
Other than to say that if we take all of the data with transparency, I keep coming back to that word, I think the preponderance of evidence is that Joseph Smith did introduce and practice plural marriage, and that those who believe otherwise are put in a pretty bad spot, because when you pick up one end of a stick, you pick up the other end. And you can say, well, Joseph wasn't a polygamist. Well, now, wait a minute. Brigham Young said he was, and that Section 132 is a real revelation. Russell M. Nelson said Joseph Smith was a polygamist, and that Section 132 is a revelation. So if you're not just saying Joseph wasn't a polygamist, you're saying that prophets of our church are wrong, and so how do you follow men that are that wrong? Some people say, well, they're wrong on some things, but they're right on others, and they try to carve out a way for that. But there's a cognitive dissonance built into that idea. But the other problem with the polygamy deniers, I think I alluded to earlier, is that by teaching Joseph didn't do it, they also teach that polygamy's wrong. The Bible condemns polygamy. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't. And polygamy is bad and hard. Well, yes, it's all of that, and that's why I'm glad we aren't expected to do it here. But if you teach people polygamy is wrong and then they learn Joseph did it, then Joseph's doing things that are wrong. So either Brigham did things that are wrong or Joseph did things that are wrong. And I think it's just testimony destroying. The whole movement is setting people up to lose their testimony in Joseph Smith and the restoration. That's my big concern.
Right. I think that's an important concern for us to recognize. Okay, this last section that we will discuss, and again, I feel like we've hit most of this pretty good, but I'd just ask if you have any additional things you'd have, is Joseph Smith's practice in polygamy. Here in your article, you talk about, you explained that for Joseph Smith and his plural wives, polygamy was a religious practice, which I think is an important thing to recognize. At the very beginning of your article, you say, through an assortment of accusations, the CES letter depicts Joseph Smith as a libido-driven liar. But right here, you're explaining that polygamy is not because Joseph Smith is sexual and wants all of this. To him, it was a religious practice. But then you also explained the evidence of sexuality in each of his many wives, as far as we know and as far as the evidence shows. What other additional things would you explain with Joseph Smith's particular practice?
Well, Kathleen Flake has pointed out, and it's so accurate, that if Joseph were a charismatic leader who wanted sex, and we can think of David Koresh or Jim Jones, and that's what he's after. He certainly could have found it in a much easier way than introducing plural marriage. These were plural marriages. See, John Bennett was twisting it with his spiritual wifery. He was just saying, hey, we can have sex, just don't tell anybody. Okay, now that's an easy way to expand your sexual opportunities. But these were marriages that Joseph Smith was introducing, and the data shows that he was concerned about every one of them. He made sure every one of them within his abilities was taken care of. There were obligations. And I saw a bumper sticker once that said that the punishment for polygamy is 2 wives. And the point is that when you have a second wife, you have a second mother-in-law, but you also have a second obligation. And trying to keep things happy and avoid jealousy in that scenario it can be very difficult. So there are obligations. And that is not a way to easily expand, again, your sexual opportunities. But that's what Joseph did. I would also mention that there's a lot of people who talk about Joseph pushing back against the concept initially, that he had his doubts about it. He didn't want to do it. And we could say, well, that was just, Joseph Smith putting up a smokescreen. But really, there are lots of people relating that initially, and that it could have been his true feelings, because he knew what it would do to his marriage with Emma. It would be a real trial. But I did a study a few years ago where I followed all of the 35 women that I have on my list of wives after the martyrdom, to try to follow and figure out what happened to them. Was there any of them that later said, you know what, Joseph was just looking for sex? That's what this was all about. There's not a single one who did that. Even the half a dozen or so that left the church, not a single one of them looked back and says, it was just a cover-up for debauchery or something like that. Every one of them treated those marriages with some respect. And you have to understand, well, okay, they may have been embarrassed about it if they'd have said this was wrong, but there were publications that would have loved to have gotten dirt on Joseph Smith and have a single wife come out and say, oh, no, this wasn't real plural marriage. This was something else that was very degrading. And none of that happened. They all followed most of them followed Joseph to Salt Lake. And the few that left, still treated those marriages as a religious practice.
I think that's excellent. If you're okay with it, Brian, I'd like to jump into some of the questions that some of our friends on Instagram have. Is that okay?
That'd be great.
Now, most of these questions have already been answered, so I'm not going to ask the ones that have already been answered. And some of these, I don't think that... I think lots of these are just simple answers. Some of them you can go a little bit deeper in, but some of them I think we've talked about, so you can just give some simple answers. Okay, so this first question that we'll ask is it true that Joseph Smith sent his friends on missions, then married their wives?
This is a claim that was generated by John C. Bennett in 1842. And it's interesting because the claim doesn't define, well, are the women divorcing their husband on a mission? Or is Joseph a second husband? Is this polyandry, or is this just consecutive husbands thing? So there's some ambiguity there. But I, by my count, there's 14 women that fall into this category. I researched them all. 3 of them, we don't have dates for their sealing ceremony to Joseph, but 10 of the men were not on missions. The only one that might have been on a mission was Orson Hyde, who was an apostle who stayed devoted to Joseph. But we have 2 sealing dates for his wife's sealing to Joseph Smith. It's Miranda. And one is while he's on his mission. This is the 1.5 years to Palestine, to dedicate Palestine. But the other sealing date to Joseph, which is in an affidavit that she signed, is actually after his return. So it's false.
Okay, awesome. The church claims to no longer practice polygamy. Is it still practiced through sealings, and why?
It's no mystery that a man can still be sealed to more than one wife in the temple today, as long as the other wives are deceased. And that creates eternal marriage in heaven. And President Nelson, President Oaks are 2 examples of that. And the reality is, my response to that is, it doesn't sound fair. And we get that. On earth, it doesn't feel fair. It doesn't sound fair. But we know so little about eternal marriage, and we know even less about eternal plural marriage. Now, there are voices out there that tell women they should worry about and fret about eternal plural marriage possibilities. My daughter threatened her husband to not die before she does, because she was afraid she would die and he would be sealed to a second wife. And I get, and I think we understand those concerns, but really we're worried about the unknown. And in the eternities, there's eternal resources, eternal time, eternal love. I mean, we can't imagine what it would look like there. I'm not defending it, because I think it still sounds really bad. But since we know so little about it, we can trust God's promises that those who are exalted, those who are worthy, will have eternal happiness, will have everlasting happiness. I think we can trust those promises and just try to wait to know about these other things.
I love that. What percent, and I think there's maybe 3 more that I'm going to ask here, but what percentage of the early church actually practiced polygamy?
There has been talk that polygamy was practiced because there was an abundance of women over men. That's not true. But in Utah, the greater number was up to like 25% in certain areas. And it could have touched in one way or the other up to half of the membership, depending upon where you are. And by that, I mean, if we count the children of it and relatives and things that are involved. But it's never been, when I say 50%, it's probably never been a majority. And there are certainly stories of devout monogamists who were bishops for 40 years. And, whatever their sin was about not entering into polygamy, apparently it wasn't enough to get them kicked out as being bishops. So there's ambiguity in those times as well.
This is probably this is the most common question in here. And as I was preparing for this podcast, I was talking to some of my friends, and multiple of my friends asked the same question as well. So this will be our last one from our followers on Instagram, and then I just have one final question for you after this. But often I find there isn't time to go into a long talking about when friends come to you and ask you questions about polygamy. Often I find there isn't time to go into a long history and detailed explanation. I know likely we can't convince someone so briefly, but maybe to defend our beliefs, do you have a shortened response or advice to members of the church to answer friends' questions about polygamy in just a few minutes instead of trying to go into the full history of everything that's happened?
Great question. And let's face it, that if I were to ask 100 people on the street corner in Cincinnati the question, Joseph Smith introduced polygamy to the Mormons, why do you think he did it? The 100% are going to say, well, libido, he wanted sex. And so we need to understand that when people hear about Joseph Smith and polygamy, their default, their assumption is this is all about sex. And so trying to deflect that may not be realistic. But the easiest answer is to just say Joseph Smith was a prophet restorer, and he restored Old Testament polygamy. Abraham was a polygamist. Jacob was a polygamist. And that's inadequate on several levels, and yet it's accurate, and it may be all that you need to say.
I think that's a great response, and a very simple response as well that I think can help people recognize our beliefs as Latter-day Saints as well. Brian, as we conclude, my final question is, again, you've studied this more extensively than just about anybody else in the church. I'm confident that you have reached points where you have seen something that has maybe caused a little bit of a question or a concern, as that is with every single person in the church. You're going to come across something that you might question. How have you been able to get through those moments, and why have you decided, I believe it's a choice, why have you chosen to stay a faithful Latter-day Saint and disciple of Jesus Christ?
Again, a very good question. And when I was researching this, and I kind of alluded to this, I think I had people ask me if I was worried about what I would find. I actually never found anything that made me really worry about it. Joseph wasn't perfect. He wouldn't want us to think that he was perfect, but he was always worthy, and that was my conclusion. But I had always thought that he couldn't produce the Book of Mormon in 1829, so that's why I started studying that question in 2015. And I've come to realize that he didn't have the skills in any way. And the current narrative, which is most popular, that Joseph was just smart enough to do it, it needs to be tested. And as I've been testing it, I don't find that to be the least bit persuasive. And so for those who worry, who need something tangible, the Book of Mormon is tangible evidence of a miracle that Joseph did something that he didn't have the ability to do. And I find that you can fall back on that position. Somebody said the Book of Mormon is the knot at the end of my faith rope that keeps you from falling off. And I've got a database of over 200 explanations by atheists and naturalists of how Joseph did it. None of them are plausible. And I'm analyzing these in this book that I'm doing. But we really do have a tangible miracle in the Book of Mormon. And I stay there, stay with that, pray, attend, keep your covenants, and these things will work out. Just do those three things.
Brian, I think that is a powerful conclusion. Again, thank you so much for your expertise, and thank you for joining us here on the CES Letters podcast. I'd like to thank all of our listeners today for joining us. I thank you for your time and for your attention to these details. Again, we did not answer all of your questions. I seriously doubt today. If you want to find answers to your questions, continue your study by going to cesletters.org, by reading the article that Brian wrote about this specific topic, and to include the Spirit in this and to continue in your prayer and in your study. We thank you so much. Make sure to share this with all of the truth seekers in your life, and we'll talk to you next time.